Okay. So our special guest today is Professor Ian Parker. Good afternoon, Professor Parker. And good morning and good evening to everyone attending this discussion from different parts of the world. I will take this opportunity to formally introduce Professor Parker. Ian Parker was co-founder in 1991 and is currently co-director with Professor Erica Berman of the Discourse Unit. His research and writing have been in the field of psychoanalysis, psychology, and social theory, with a particular focus on discourse, critical psychology, mental health, and political practice. He is Emeritus Professor of Management at the University of Leicester and has visiting professional posts in Brazil, South Africa, Spain, and the UK. He is a practicing psychoanalyst and is currently Honorary Secretary of the College of Psychoanalysts, UK. He is Secretary of Manchester Psychoanalytic Matrix and Managing Editor of the Annual Review of Critical Psychology. His books include Psychoanalysis, Clinic and Context, Subjectivity, History and Autobiography, and with David Pavontuela, Psychoanalysis and Revolution, Critical Psychology for Liberation Movements. It's such a pleasure to finally have you here on the screen, Professor Parker. Thank you for agreeing to be a part of this interview. It was such a pleasant surprise. So in our discussion today, we'll try to deal with the sensitive subject of Ian Parker's phenomenal book, Psychoanalysis and Revolution, which challenges the practice and philosophy of professionals, both psychologists and psychiatrists, and complicates the notion of the Freudian unconscious. And also for the participants, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box, or you can switch on your audio and ask them directly to Professor Parker at the end of the session. Okay, so here we begin with the questions, Professor Parker. My first question would be, contrary to the claim by conventional psychoanalysis that every individual is unique owing to their past experiences, are you suggesting, of course, in your book, that due to their ideological conditioning and oppressive political environment, all of us are in fact the same?
Well, we share a lot of things in common, but we're certainly not the same. And that's not an assumption that we make in the book. Our assumption is that the individuality of each of us that we hold dear is actually betrayed by capitalism. It's capitalism as a global economic system that makes us all the same. Or it compartmentalizes us into different ethnic groups, different market niches, and treats everyone in each of those market niches as being the same. So there's a kind of refusal of this attempt to make us all the same in psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is concerned with the singularity of experience of each person as they encounter the world and try to make sense of it. What we have in common is that we all use language and we suffer in a world that is governed by exploitation and oppression. And it's that experience and that struggle to speak to each other and to understand social conditions that brings us all together. But what we have to do is to be able to recognize our singularity in order to come to terms with this world and change this terrible political economic system that we live under.
Right. But then do you consider then symptom, specifically symptom, as something to be assimilated and listened to for the positive act of liberation, rather than erased and extracted, thereby curing the individual? So what I mean to ask is if you are re-evaluating the notion of cure altogether.
Well, I think what you say is absolutely right. I don't think that we can completely cure our symptoms when we live in a world that keeps reproducing and drumming into us that we are the causes of our own problems. When we live in a world that alienates us, that separates us from our creative ability, that separates us from each other, there's no cure for that. And I would go further and I would say that there's no cure for being a human being and having to live in a world where we coexist with others and have to take others' needs into account as well as our own. But the second part of your question is whether we have to reevaluate the notion of cure. And I think that if we go back and we look at the way that Freud understood cure when he was developing psychoanalysis at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when Freud was developing psychoanalysis, he didn't actually claim that anyone would be fully cured of their symptoms. In fact, he said at one point that the most we can hope for is to transform hysterical misery into everyday unhappiness. And there's something about the condition of being a human being that we have to live with that unhappiness. I think there's something in the nature of psychoanalysis that takes seriously the difficulty of being human. And that's something that we come to term with in psychoanalysis. It's not that we make everybody completely happy. You know, that's the kind of world of US American kind of happiness culture. But I think it's a complete illusion. We have to be realistic about this. And psychoanalysis has to be as realistic as the politics that it connects with.
Right. But we also find that there is a tendency in psych professionals, especially of our times, to perceive the study of mind solely as a physiological and cognitive discourse, and not as something historical and ideological. So as if it were an insulated entity altogether. So what do you think needs to be done to redraft the discipline back to its origins?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is to refuse the discipline of psychology. So what the discipline of psychology does, it tries to tie our experience to biology or to kind of imaginary cognitive processes inside the head that the psychologist has developed in their own models. But psychology itself is a very misleading way of understanding human experience. Psychology as a discipline developed at the same time as capitalism developed. And I think that that's no accident. Psychology developed as a discipline that is concerned with understanding each individual separate from each other, enabling them to compete with each other, and reducing all of the social problems that we face to individual problems. And that's very useful for psychology as a discipline, very useful to capitalism. Because what psychology is concerned with is making people happier, better behaved, better citizens, better workers, better able to fit into the capitalist system, to adapt people to the capitalist system. Now, as capitalism was developing and as the discipline of psychology developed, an alternative approach also developed at the end of the 19th century, and that was psychoanalysis. And I think psychoanalysis has a quite different way of understanding what we are as human beings. That it goes beyond all of these biological processes that psychologists are so obsessed by. It goes beyond the individual cognitive mechanisms that psychologists think they're discovering, and it goes beyond the behavior that psychologists are busily measuring. What psychoanalysis does is listen to us as we speak about our experience and speak about our distress. So what we have developing through the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century is a political economic system and some political alternatives that try and understand this system. Those alternatives would include Marxism, feminism, the anti-colonial movements developing through the 20th century. And those movements try to understand what it would be to build a better world, an alternative to capitalism. And at the same time, psychoanalysis is developing as an alternative to psychology. Psychoanalysis is trying to think about the nature of distress as something that is a function of family relationships and work relationships. And what's so fascinating, if you go back to the origins of psychoanalysis, is that many of the psychoanalysts in Europe were on the left. And there's no accident. That's no accident, because the psychoanalysts understood that there's something about the social conditions that we live in that needs to be taken seriously as well. As the years went on, as psychoanalysis became under attack, when psychoanalysts had to flee Europe with the rise of fascism in the 1930s, that link between social change and personal change was broken. So what the book Psychoanalysis and Revolution aims to do, the book that I co-wrote with David Pavón-Cuéllar, a Mexican colleague and comrade, what that book tries to do is to take us back to that history and to make the links again. Now, people have been making those links over and over and over again in the past 100 years. So we're not doing anything that's very new, but we're trying to remind people that those links are important and that we can find an alternative to psychology, an alternative to the reductionist approach that psychology engages in. And it's not so much taking psychology back to its origins, it's ditching psychology altogether, and psychiatry, of course, and taking us back to the origins of psychoanalysis as something that is potentially very radical.
Right, fantastic. So how do you propose to depersonalize past, which, let's say, apart from being a product of ideology and politics, is also thoroughly, familial and individualized, and depersonalize it and make it collective and primary cause, the primary cause behind emancipatory revolution, let's say.
Yeah, I think rather than depersonalizing it, it's about collectivizing our experience in such a way precisely that personalizes it. That is, makes it meaningful to each of us. So I think one of the problems with mainstream psychology and psychiatry is that it depersonalizes us. It treats us as mechanisms. It treats us as objects. It treats us as if we're all the same. What psychoanalysis does is it personalizes the treatment, listens to each person one by one, their own particular experience of their oppression, their own particular experience of their lives. And what psychoanalysis does is to enable us then to make a link between personal change and social change. And that's particularly what we aim to do in this book. I have a kind of double problem here, is that mainstream psychology and psychiatry depersonalizes us, and we need to personalize things again. Yeah. And the other side of the problem is that a lot of politics, including radical politics, also depersonalizes us. The mainstream politicians treat us like idiots, as if we have no thoughts about our own liberation. And even some of the alternative left organizations also operate in quite a bureaucratic, alienating way that depersonalizes us again. So one of the things that we learn through the history of radical politics is that we need to connect personal change with social change, and that gives us an opportunity to personalize politics as well.
Right. So in your book, you talk of turning around the metaphor of illness and sickness, asserting that it is society that is diseased, and therefore we have the patient in the clinic, so to say. So there is definitely a kind of causal relation attached to it. So my question is, do you put forward a notion of a medicalized society as an infected body, where activists can act as psychoanalysts? So how else do you bring society, so to say, to the clinic?
Yeah, I'm a little bit wary of the medical metaphors here. I wouldn't want to bring the medical metaphors in to understand society. And this idea that society is a kind of infected body, I think could be a little bit problematic. It's a kind of image of society that is used by the far right. You know, if you look at old fascist writings, for example, they saw society as being infected, and they wanted to clear away the disease, and they searched for kind of external causes that were responsible for infecting the society and aimed to wipe them out. So it is like a problematic metaphor. So rather than use that metaphor of infection, I would say that society is a place that causes distress. That society, as it is organized at the moment, is something that divides us from each other and makes us unable to think about the way our distress is connected with our families, with our working environments, with the institutions that we're part of. And so we do need to be able to think about how we can organize together in order to develop alternatives. So activists might make use of psychoanalysis in order to understand their own distress. But I suppose rather than activists turning into psychoanalysts, I would rather that psychoanalysts turn into activists, you know, that psychoanalysts actually think about what they're doing and their own responsibility to social change as well as personal change. And so psychoanalysts start to become more actively involved in political movements, speaking about what they know about distress, linking with trade unionists, people in the liberation movements, and sharing ideas, and also critically reflecting on their own practice alongside political activists, so that so what they're doing in the clinic is also informed by the work that they're doing politically.
Right. Now coming to the very critical part of your book. So for you, the unconscious is the other generated by capitalism, sexism, colonialism that enters us through language. So it is the other of language, so to say, that comes out during protests and rebellions and gatherings against injustice. So we must live not with the concrete ego, but with the malleable unconscious without exorcising it. So my question is, does the unconscious manifest itself through relational coexistence of speaking subjects? And is it the outcome of the marginalized uniting for a common liberating cause?
I don't think I can do better than your question there. I think you sum it up very well. I like that. I like that a lot. I like the way that you formulated it. You know, there's something, the unconscious is sometimes treated by psychologists and psychiatrists as if the unconscious is something inside us, inside our heads. You know, maybe it's in the back of the brain or something, and we need to be able to kind of dig it out or get rid of it. But the unconscious is much more complicated phenomenon than that. When we learn to speak a language, which you know, we all do in different ways, even if it's not verbal, it might be using sign language or other forms of communication. But whatever language we learn to use, it's organized, it's structured. There are things organized as meanings in the language that we can't completely control or comprehend. You know, that's why, you know, when we're talking to each other, it's so easy to misunderstand each other because there's lots of things that creep into the language, assumptions in the metaphors and turns of phrase that we use that make it difficult for us to actually communicate with each other. That's part of the kind of tragic condition of being a human being. But when we learn a language, we have to kind of push aside all of those other meanings that we can't control. And they kind of operate there in the kind of background as a kind of unconscious subtext, or the unconscious background to the conscious things that we're thinking about and talking about. And for each of us, there are elements of that unconscious that are quite particular to us. Traumatic things that have happened to us, things that upset us, things that we find it difficult to think about, that we push away into the unconscious as well, that we do our best not to think about. And so the unconscious is always there as a kind of other scene, an other place that we live with. And among those things that we push away are the causes of our unhappiness. And political activity is one place where we start to think about the things that have happened to us. We recognize some commonalities with other people, and maybe the unconscious becomes manifest, as you say. It becomes evident to us. There are elements of our experience that we've pushed out of our minds, we've stopped ourselves from thinking about, and we're able to connect with those again. So it doesn't only happen in the psychoanalytic clinic. It might be something that happens in our collective political activity as well. I could just give you, while I'm talking about this, I'm reminded that my colleague and comrade, David Pavon-Cuellar, has a very neat formulation where he says that mainstream psychology and psychiatry treats the unconscious as interior to us. But actually, it is consciousness, our consciousness, that is interior, that is something we experience as being inside our heads, whereas the unconscious is exterior. So there's an unconscious exterior and a conscious interior. And David has written about this at great length in some wonderful writing about discourse and discourse analysis. And that idea was very important to both of us as we were writing this book. The unconscious is something collective and exterior, and we in some way connect with that when we engage in psychoanalysis or when we engage in political activity.
Right, very interesting. But so in your book you write that and I'm quoting it, the unconscious is politics. So in what ways are you deviating from Jacques Lacan's, when he said unconscious structured like a language?
Well, now you've caught me a bit, because both David and I, we're both very influenced by Jacques Lacan's work, because Lacan was a psychoanalyst who shifted attention from wired in ages and stages of development and kind of biological kind of instincts. Lacan shifted attention away from those things to language. So Lacan is someone who's very important in both of our work. But the Psychoanalysis and Revolution book is not a Lacanian book, okay? It's a book that is about psychoanalysis in general. So it's something that should be understandable to people working in the relational psychoanalysis tradition, or the Kleinian tradition, or the object relations tradition. It's not only Lacanian. And so we're very keen to have discussions with people who are radicals, who are Marxists, who are feminists, anti-colonial activists. We're very keen to have conversations with them about how these ideas might connect with their own practice as well, not only with the Lacanians. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, as far as this statement is concerned, the unconscious is politics. This is where you've caught me, because this phrase is a phrase from Lacan. He says the unconscious is politics. And Lacan is someone who said many different contradictory things. It's one of the difficulties in reading Lacan's work, is that he says things that at one moment that are very different from others. But I think in this case, to say the unconscious is politics is entirely compatible with his statement that the unconscious is structured like a language. Or one of his other statements, which is that the unconscious is the discourse of the other. You see, the unconscious is the discourse of the other fits perfectly with what I was saying a moment ago about the unconscious being exterior. And so the unconscious being structured like a language is drawing attention to the ways in which these unconscious processes are molded by our engagement with language. It's not structured like a language in a kind of mysterious biological way as some kind of analog, but actually it's structured like a language precisely because we speak, precisely because we're speaking beings, and language is so intimate and important to us. So when we're saying the unconscious is politics, we're saying this domain of the unconscious is where the real political work needs to happen. You know, politics isn't when you consciously, deliberately go into the polling booth and decide where to put your mark on the election tab. That's not politics. Politics is where you go into the street and you talk to people and you become involved in demonstrations, trying to build movements, involved in strikes and so on. So there's a kind of collective element in that work, which means that it's as much to do with unconscious processes as it is to do with politics, real politics. That's what we mean by the unconscious is politics here.
Right. So coming to the aspect of repetition. So is repetition merely a symptom, or is it symptomatic of our repetitive behaviors inside a capitalist framework? So is it the work of a psychoanalyst to unravel the ideologically charged symptom in the underbelly of the thoroughly individualized symptom?
It's, well, let's think about this. There's something in the way that you phrased this which is really intriguing. I think it is, repetition is something that I think afflicts us all, but repetition is something that is particularly intensified and given particular pathological aspects by our engagement in capitalism. Because capitalism, you know, capitalism is a peculiar political economic system. Capitalism, on the one hand, is about perpetual change. It launches us into a world in which nothing stays the same, where things are rapidly changing all the time, out of our control. So capitalism looks as if it's always changing, as if there's no such thing as repetition. But of course, what is repeated in capitalism is the injunction that you should buy things and that you should work. And the form of the exploitation in capitalism is something that repeats over and over and over again. And a lot of our work in capitalism is very repetitive. It's not surprising that repetition should be such a significant part of our lives when we have to keep engaging in the same tasks over and over again. Now, people working in factories will know this very well, because the work process is segmented into different minute components, which each person has to keep repeating over and over again. But even in the academic world, you know, we have to keep repeating the same thing over and over again, either in our classes or in the ideas that we develop in our theoretical work. So, as well as the forms of participation in conferences and seminars and, you know, meetings like this, where we repeat the ideas over and over again. But repetition is certainly something that is intensified and made more difficult and made more distressing. Let's put it that way. Repetition becomes something that is more distressing in capitalism and becomes inside us and difficult to shape. So we are looking at the effects of repetition, and we're looking at the kind of the deeper causes of repetition in the kind of social relations that we're part of.
Right. But especially with regards to protest, why do you think protesters, masses desiring liberation and enacting rebellion fail so often in their struggle to reach the ideal state? So what I mean to ask is, what role do suffering and enjoyment play in it?
Well, sometimes that struggle to change the world does mean that we set up ideals. There's no doubt about that, and that's something that keeps people going sometimes. But you know, if you look at political theory, radical political theory, I think you find a lot of caution and a lot of warnings about setting up ideal blueprints and trying to aim for an ideal world in which all conflict will be erased and there'll be no problems. That's why, for example, in Marx's writing, he was very clear that it wouldn't be a good idea to set up a blueprint for a communist society. The task isn't to aim to put that ideal into practice, but rather the aim is to increase our level of participation, to increase our level of democratic control, to increase the accountability of the people who say that they're speaking for us, to engage in that process so we become more actively involved in the world. And it's through that process that something of the communist way of being comes into practice, and so that I suppose that's one side of my answer to your question there about the ideal state. Why do they fail? Why they fail? Partly because of the terrible nature of their own organizations that reproduce the forms of oppression that they're supposed to be fighting. Okay, that's part of it. But also because capitalism is extremely powerful. Capitalism is able to incorporate radical ideas and turn radical ideas against us. And capitalism has at its disposal a state apparatus in which there's forms of violent coercion that are brought into play whenever people are on the edge of actually taking control of their own lives. So the capitalist state is able to, through use of military maneuvers, coup d'etat, invasion, is able to clamp down on liberation movements and to prevent those rebellions from succeeding. So we're in a situation where many people want a better world. They struggle for a better world. They try to find ways of bringing that about, and they're bashed back over and over again by the capitalist state. The other part of your question was about suffering and enjoyment. Well, there's certainly plenty of suffering, but I think we also have to admit that some people do enjoy these processes, and that's something that that psychoanalysis helps us to think about, helps us to explore the ways in which we become attached to things that are harmful to us. We become attached to them in a way that is self-sabotaging, and we become attached to our symptoms as things that express what we are as individuals and define who we are. So that's the place where we start to enjoy our symptoms, and we start to enjoy the terrible things that are happening to us. It's contradictory and psychoanalysis is one of the ways in which we can reflect on that, and to help us to find more genuinely liberating ways forward, and to reflect on the ways in which we're held back and the ways in which we sometimes hold ourselves back as well.
So are you referring to it as a pattern? Do you think it's a pattern also, that you suffer, you enjoy, and then you repeat the entire thing? Is it a pattern?
You could say it was a pattern. Yeah, you could say it was a pattern, but it's a pattern that is structured. It's structured by the organizations that we're part of. It's structured into the societies that we live in. It's structured in the families that we were brought up in, and it's structured in the forms of language that we use to describe who we are. So, one of the things that we repeat in the clinic, for example, is a story about what kind of person we should be. And that little story that we repeat in the clinic is something that is, sometimes it's shared, it has commonalities with other people around us, but it's also quite particular to our own experience, what we've been told by our parents, by our caregivers, what we've heard on the radio, what we've seen on the television, that we imagine that we should be this kind of person. Maybe we should be working hard. Maybe we should write more books. Maybe we should, kind of like get up in the morning and, work hard. We should be good citizens. All of these little things become part of who we are, and we repeat them. We repeat them as narratives, as stories about who we are. And I suppose one of the things that we experience in the psychoanalytic clinic is that we repeat these stories over and over and over again until we start to realize that they are complete nonsense. That there's something ridiculous about this. And worse than that, there's something about these stories that is locking us into place, and that there are other ways of describing who we are that we can develop as we develop different narratives, develop different stories, learn different ways of being with other people. And one of the places that we learn different ways of being and we learn to speak in a different way is when we're involved in a political movement. It's one of the striking things about radical politics is that we not only engage in political action to change the world, but in the process, we learn to refer to other people as comrades. We develop different forms of solidarity, and we start to think about ourselves in a different way as well.
Right. Okay, this is very personal to me, the next question. So as it seems, let's say no one is outside power, the power structure, and consequently we all are prone to this repetitive compulsion and our guilt and pleasure from it. So are you prescribing the clinic or liberation movements for everyone? And if that is true, and knowing that such movements are rare, shouldn't there be more government-sponsored clinics and analysts available at subsidized rates?
Okay, let's take the second bit first about the government-sponsored clinics. I think the answer to that is yes. Yes, it should be available to people if they want to make use of it. And again, if you go back to the early history of psychoanalysis, Freud was actively involved in supporting free clinics in Budapest and Vienna and Berlin. There's a wonderful book by sociologist Elizabeth Danto called Freud's Free Clinics, where she goes back into this history and she shows that these free clinics were an integral part of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalytic organizations subsidized them financially, and the psychoanalysts, including Freud, if they couldn't take on a patient who was unable to pay, then they would write little vouchers, and those vouchers would be taken to another psychoanalyst. And so the person who had written the voucher, psychoanalyst, maybe it might be Freud himself, would pay for the treatment. So there was cross-subsidizing of treatment, and the free clinics were part of that institutional form of that free clinic movement. Freud gave a speech in 1919 in Budapest, where he said that psychoanalysis should be available to people free of charge. It was like making psychoanalysis available as part of what would be the equivalent of a national health service. So I think we need to push for these kinds of free clinics to be made available for people who need and want this kind of support, this kind of treatment. But here we have a problem. And part of the problem is that because psychoanalysis over the years has become caught up in a kind of medical way of understanding people, and because psychoanalysis is so individualized, a lot of the psychoanalysis that we have in the public hospitals is, well, let's put it bluntly, it's not psychoanalysis at all. And so we have a real problem there, that we want to increase access to psychoanalysis for people, but we also need to challenge what that psychoanalysis is doing and how that psychoanalysis is operating. So that's a task. It's a political task of making clear what psychoanalysis really is, as something different from psychology and psychiatry. Okay, so let's go back to the first bit of your question, is that are we prescribing the clinic to everybody? I say absolutely not. No. You know, I like psychoanalysis. I find it really interesting. I find it really useful, but a lot of people don't. A lot of people think it's nonsense. A lot of people find other ways of understanding themselves, either through religious practices of different kinds, spiritual things. We learn this from the liberation theology movements in Latin America, for example, that there's a way of connecting personal distress with collective processes in liberation theology. And that's something that David Pavón-Cuéllar always reminded me of. I've known David for many years, and in some of my other writings about psychoanalysis, I had some very harsh things to say about religion. And David always used to say to me, no, Ian, you don't understand. Here in Mexico, it can be very important for people. You can't simply shut it out and pretend that only psychoanalysis is the way to go forward. No, there are other ways of being human that we need to be aware of as well. So people have lots of different ways of understanding their distress, making sense of it, finding ways of cure, let's say, use the word cure in a very broad sense, of curing, treating their distress and finding better ways to live. It certainly doesn't have to be psychoanalysis. And I would even say, and I say this reluctantly because I dislike psychology so much, it might even be for some people that cognitive behavioral therapy as a short-term way of helping people to cope could be useful for people. I think what's important is that people have a choice and that they find ways of accessing services and that they're in control of the treatments that they're being given. So that's not whether it's psychiatry or psychology or psychoanalysis, it's not something that is handed down to them as an expert who tells them, this is the way you are, this is the way you must be cured, but rather people have some way of thinking about these possibilities and engaging in these practices with a clearer understanding of what they want to get out of it.
Right. So if you consider liberation rebellions as explorations of the potential of our unconscious, would you also say that protest literature in the form of pamphlets and slogans and poetry also exposes the unconscious domain of language? So isn't it an exploration of the other side of language, one that attacks the dominant narrative?
Yes, absolutely. I think you put it very well there. I think that's very true. And it kind of links with the answer to the last question. It links with what I was just saying, is that people find different ways of making sense of their experience. And they might do that by writing poetry, or they might do it by writing political pamphlets. There's a long tradition inside psychoanalysis of understanding the way that people make sense of distress through writing. And it sometimes can be a little bit problematic. For example, there are lots of discussions in Lacanian psychoanalysis about James Joyce. James Joyce was a writer who wrote in a very, very poetic, cryptic, metaphorical way, very difficult to read, very fluid, open form of language. And some of the psychoanalysts would say that James Joyce, he was able to write as a way of curing himself, that he was kind of psychotic in some way, and his writing, his creative writing, was a cure, was a way of holding himself together and being able to survive in the world. Now, I kind of like go with that part of the way. That is, I agree that maybe James Joyce made use of his writing, his poetic writing, as a way of connecting with what was unconscious in his experience. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that therefore we can give him a psychiatric diagnosis and say he was a psychotic. I really, it doesn't matter to me, whether he was psychotic or neurotic, and I don't think we can tell, because we don't have him on the couch and he's not speaking to us. He's not interpreting himself, his own symptoms. So it's not the kind of diagnosis that we can make. But I think for many people, they are able to access and connect with what is unconscious in their experience through their writing, through their poetry, through protest literature as well. And through the protest literature, of course, then there can be a link with politics at the same time.
Right. So if you read, so let's say in your book, you read the drive as the animal part of ourselves that has not been tamed by language. So however, it can be employed by language in resistance. So is animality, and that's my question, is animality therefore the necessary precondition for all subversive acts? So are you therefore hinting at an interrelational world rather than a hierarchical one? And isn't it high time for psychoanalysis to revise the notion of animality and not to review it as something which is which resides in the unconscious?
Yeah, it's this question of what is animal, I think is really interesting, and I think you're right that we would need to revise it. There's a danger in kind of traditional conservative psychoanalysis, the mainstream psychoanalysis in the English-speaking world. There's a danger that animality is seen as something kind of lower down. It's to do with our biology. It's something that is pushing in us from a kind of the lizard part of our brain or something like that, that their kind of instincts are kind of bubbling up as kind of biological processes from our kind of our past, our evolutionary past. But I think you're right. We need to revise what this understanding of animality is, because we're human beings, and because language defines how we think about ourselves as human beings, and because language defines how we think about what we are as different from the animals, we have to take seriously what that language is doing, and the way that that language kind of like positions us as superior beings, you know, and animals are kind of just kind of objects to be kept as pets, or to be killed for our food, or whatever, or put in zoos. You know, that way of thinking about what is animal and what is animal to us is very destructive and alienating. Now, I don't want to sound like an old hippie, but you know, human beings share this world with animals and with the other animal species, as we do with the trees and the plants and the rest of the ecology that makes us what we are. It's not possible to be a human being unless we live as part of an ecology, and that ecology includes the animals as well. So we need to rethink who we are in relation to these animals, and rethink how we value and take seriously their suffering as well as our suffering. And if we start to think in a different way about what is animal within us, then maybe we can think in a different way about instincts and drives, not as things that are threats to us, but things that are part of us. Yeah, it's part of our broader kind of experience of what it is to be a human subject, that we experience our bodies, we experience what comes from our bodies. And psychoanalysis is a way of taking that aspect of our lives seriously. You know, we are more than our consciousness, more than our little egos. And what we are as human beings is the network of relationships that we come into when we become conscious of who we are as we grow up. And what is unconscious, what we are, is also all of the stuff in the world that we navigate, including the other animals.
Right. Now let me take a very powerful phrase used in your book, and I quote, you write bodies as sites of refusal, unquote, and ask you if you differentiate between sit-in protests, which is quite literally denial of bodies of their role as moving machines of production, and protest marches, which is again bodies in action or counteraction. So what is your way of reading dissenting bodies?
Well, what is common to both of these things, even in sit-down protests, is that people are doing it deliberately, and they're doing it with other people. I mean, even when Rosa Parks sat down in the white bit of the bus in the United States, she didn't do it as an individual sitting in the bus. She was part of a political movement. This is sometimes forgotten in the histories of the struggles against racism in the United States and the role of Rosa Parks. She was part of a political movement. And so sitting down for her was a collective activity. It looked as if it was individual, but it was collective. And when people are involved in sit-ins, they're usually doing it alongside other people, or they're doing it as part of a political movement, which they've discussed with other people and will have public, symbolic, collective effects. So I would say that there isn't really such a big difference, not a big conceptual difference between the sit-ins and the protest marches, but that they're different ways of engaging in politics and different ways of engaging in collective activity. So yeah, they're both ways of bringing the body into play in politics. And let's take it back to the clinic again. Let's go to the connection with the clinic again. Even when you go to the psychoanalytic clinic in individual psychoanalysis, sometimes it might be in group analysis, okay? Psychoanalysis doesn't have to be individual, but say if you even go into your individual psychoanalytic clinic, you're doing something with your body. You're having to take your body. to the clinic. You're having to lie there. You're having to endure the uncomfortable experience of speaking to someone that you can't see because they're behind you on the couch. There's something about the embodied experience that is very, very important there. So bodies are always involved in the things that we're doing as human beings. So although I was talking about the importance of language earlier, language is incredibly important to psychoanalysis. That language is also deeply connected with our body all the time, connected to our bodily states, our states of arousal, our states of excitation, our states of agitation, annoyance, happiness. All of these things are linked in with the language. So the language we speak may refer to our emotional states, but as we speak, we feel, it's in our body as well. So when we say that bodies can be sites of refusal, it's where we're taking deliberate choices with other people in order to bring our bodies into political action.
Right. So my next question is a very straightforward one. So in our consumerist culture, can there be sex without language? Sex without sex being corrupted by logos, so to say, or sex without, as you put it, cultural metabolism of sexuality. So what is the route to be taken to exit this sex linked to with death drive, so to say?
No, I think the bad news is that there's no sex without language. No, I don't. I think it's an illusion. There's always a setting for sex, isn't there? There's always the engagement with another, the forms of explicit or implicit consent, discussion, the framing of the relationship, whether that's a relationship that is mutual, where there's love on both sides, or even a relationship that is brutal and violent, where there's rape. Even in that case, there is language. There is a framing of it symbolically, either to acknowledge and appreciate another body, or to demean it and humiliate it. I don't think there's any way out of that. Sex is bound up with language. We speak about it. We enjoy sex as we speak about it, as much for some people as when they actually do it. But even when we engage in sex, there's something symbolic, there's something meaningful in that activity. And even at those moments where we imagine that we've escaped language and we've gone into some kind of blissful or orgasmic state that is kind of outside language, my guess, okay, maybe there's something momentary in this, but it's always covered over and given meaning very quickly as an experience, and so we're caught back in language again. And it's something that psychoanalysis, and this question that you raise here, is something that psychoanalysis has tried to grapple with over and over again over the last 100 or so years, in trying to make sense of our bodily experiences as things outside language. And there have been plenty of radical psychoanalysts. I'm thinking of the work of Wilhelm Reich in Germany, in Austria and Germany in the 1920s, or think of the work of Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s, 1970s. There are attempts, always attempts, to try and go outside language and find a way of accessing those things that are happening outside language. But one of the bets that we make in the Psychoanalysis and Revolution book is that everything about psychoanalysis and everything about human experience, our subjectivity, is bound up with language. It's framed by language, the different languages that we speak, the different cultures that we're part of. And so we need to take that seriously. I think there's a danger of romanticizing things that are outside language. And when you romanticize things that are outside language and try to describe them, you only have to think for a second to realize that you're describing them in language. You know, there's no escape from this.
Right.
So the answer to your question is no.
Right. So what, according to you, causes this fundamental error in analysis when it comes to solving the puzzle or interpreting the situation of the analysand patient, if I'm allowed to say that. So is the analyst's objectivity at all possible inside the clinic?
Okay, there's two parts to this question. Let's take the second bit first about objectivity. No, I don't think it's possible for an analyst to be objective. I think the most that an analyst can hope for is that they have an awareness of how their subjectivity is implicated in the analytic process. That is, they have an idea of how they're not being objective and how it's impossible to be objective. And some psychoanalysts outside the Lacanian tradition, say, for example, those influenced by Melanie Klein or by object relations, also the relational psychoanalysts, that some analysts would use this subjectivity in order to understand the countertransference better, to understand what they're experiencing in the clinic, and to use that in a way to kind of access aspects of the unconscious communication that are happening in the clinic. So when they pretend to be objective, then there's a problem. There's a problem that their supervisors would very quickly point out to them, because it's the subjectivity that they have that is a crucial tool for their clinical work. Yeah, it's my subjectivity that is crucial rather than objectivity. Now, some psychoanalysts, many psychoanalysts, would imagine that if they have nothing to do with politics, then they can be more objective in the clinic, that they won't bring in political ideas. I won't engage in any discussions about feminism or trans or racism or disability. I won't be involved in these things because I want to be objective, okay? But the problem is that these ideas and debates are carried through the language and carried through ideology, and they will have effects on people whether they like it or not, okay? So if they pretend not to have anything to do with politics, you can be sure that politics will have plenty to do with them and will have plenty of effects on their work. So it's the psychoanalysts who actively engage in politics, the psychoanalysts who bring their subjectivity to bear in politics, and in Lacanian psychoanalysis, we would refer to this as the desire of the analyst, our desire to engage in the analytic process. It's those psychoanalysts who emphasize the importance of subjectivity and who actively link with politics that are then better able to stop making political pronouncements inside the clinic. Yeah, they're in a better position to know how these political ideas affect them and to be able to leave politics at the clinic door, to not make prejudicial comments or assumptions about the nature of their patient, not to make assumptions about how this person should live their lives, what they should be like if they're a woman, how they should change their sexuality if they're lesbian or gay, all of these kind of things. Yeah. So the subjectivity is actually the key thing. So I would say that we shouldn't pretend to be objective inside the clinic. Objectivity is impossible inside the clinic. Now then, how should we deal with that then? There's always a danger when we make an interpretation, because of the nature of language, and language carries with it all kinds of assumptions. When we phrase an interpretation, we choose the words that we will use in an interpretation, there's always a danger that the analyst will bring their own assumptions, because of the forms of language that they use, into the interpretation. And I think the way to address that is to say that it's the patient or the analysand who makes the interpretations. They're the ones who do the interpreting. So in our conception of psychoanalysis, which, okay, I admit, it's quite a Lacanian conception here. I have to come clean at this point. But in our concept, but this is a debate, you know, across the domain of psychoanalysis that we can have, whatever our training. That in our conception of psychoanalysis, it's not such a good idea for the analyst to make direct interpretations. That is, it's not a good idea for the analyst to spell out what they think the meanings are in the patient's speech or in the analysand's speech. Rather, the role of the analyst is to draw attention to the repetitions of speech, to draw attention to the repeated phrases and key terms that the analysand uses, to notice the hesitations, to notice the ways in which people deviate and not speak about the things that are important to them, to notice those things, to draw attention to them, and to draw the attention to them in such a way that the analysand or patient is then in a better position to notice them themselves, those hesitations and those repetitions, those deviations, to notice those things themselves in order to come up with their own interpretation in their own language of what is happening. So I would say that it's we shouldn't interpret the situation of the analysand, but we kind of lay the conditions for the analysand to be able to do the interpretation themselves. It's like in politics. It's like in politics. It's not a good idea for leaders of political parties to tell people what they want. It's better for people to organize themselves and collectively decide what they want and how they should get it and take it for themselves. So there is a kind of parallel here between the condition of the analysand thinking for themselves, making decisions for themselves, and people in the political realm thinking for themselves collectively and making decisions for themselves.
Right, very interesting. So could you enlighten us a little bit also on the artful role of the analyst during transference, which leads the analyst to seize control and speak truth to ideological power?
Yes, well, the transference is absolutely crucial here, because in every relationship that we have, whether it's inside or outside the clinic, we kind of we repeat past relationships. You know, so when we meet someone, we have to try and make sense of who they are. We have to try and make sense of what our relationship with them is. And of course, we use past templates and patterns, experiences of relationships that we've had in the past to make sense of what this other person is and how we should relate to them. In the clinic, that repetition of relationships becomes particularly kind of charged with affect, charged with meaning. And in the clinic, we're able to reflect on that repetition as it happens. And it's that we call transference. Okay, the transference is this peculiar affectively charged repetition in the clinic that we're able to notice, comment on, and transform. Now, part of that transference relationship in the clinic is a relationship of power. Of course, it's a relationship of power because the analysand or patient most of the time is paying the analyst. They become dependent on the analyst in some way. They're very likely to experience the analyst as being a powerful figure from their past life, maybe a parental figure or some other powerful relation or person close to the family. And so the transference is a place where the analysand needs to confront that power. And in so much of analysis, people are part of the transference, but they're unable to comment on the transference or break from the transference. But that is going to be absolutely necessary for the analysis to progress. So the task of the analyst, and it connects with what I was saying before about interpretation, the task of the analyst is not to set themselves up as a kind of master. You know, I'll tell you what you think. You're doing this because you treat me like your father or something like that. And the analyst might be wrong. But the danger is that because the position of the analyst is a position of power, that the analyst will end up suggesting things to the patient, and the patient, you know, will be affected by that, will be influenced by that because of the relation of power. So the task of the analyst is to guide the treatment in such a way that they're not, and here's a kind of paradox, okay, to guide the treatment in such a way that they're not guiding the patient. To guide the treatment to enable the patient to speak for themselves and to challenge the analyst. And that's what we sometimes, that challenge is what we sometimes refer to as hystericization. So it's a particular provocation to enable people to rebel, to say no, to complain, to say, no, you're doing this to me. And you know who this reminds me of? Aha, to make the link. Ah, yes, I do this. I complain about these kind of people. I notice what's happening here because I'm doing it to you. That's where they break into the transference, they break through the transference. And so the analyst has to be very sensitive to that and to be very careful not to behave like someone who knows everything that's going on inside the analysand's head. You know, the analysand thinks that the analyst knows, but the analysand, as the analysis goes on, comes to realize that the analyst doesn't know everything. Actually, maybe they don't know much at all, but you know, they have been useful, and that's their role, to be useful.
Right. So taking the cue from your answer also, so towards the end of your book, you do mention hystericization and its deep linkages with psychoanalysis,
Yes.
and how similar kinds of hysterical expressions are also encouraged in liberation movements. So don't you think this hysteria often takes dangerous shapes under a despotic government? So I'm particularly referring to, let's say, to the hysterical, you know, when mass gatherings or mass lynchings happen. You know, what about that kind of hysteria? Or you know, let's talk about naked parading of lower castes in a country like India. So what kind of hysteria are also you're looking at?
Yeah. Well, you could say that we have forms of hysteria in the reactionary crowds or mobilizations here in Britain as well. You know, we've had plenty of kind of reactionary, hysterical mass protests against lockdown, against vaccinations. We have a history of sexist violence and racist violence by people who were whipped up into mob behavior. But this is a big but. You know, I'm a little bit wary about using these kind of psychoanalytic or psychological categories that are very useful in the clinic. I'm a bit wary about using them to understand political processes. Because one of the particularly dangerous things about reactionary crowds is that it's not that they don't know what they're doing and they're caught up in some kind of hysterical mass hysteria. Okay, it's not that they're caught up in mass hysteria, but actually the danger is that they know very well what they are doing. They become mobilized as thinking, active subjects who are agreeing with a certain kind of reactionary, destructive political program. If you have a friend, a colleague, who's not interested in psychoanalysis, I have to say, but who did research into collective protests some years ago in Britain, and he got involved in those protests as part of his research and interviewed people. These were protests against the police in a city in the south of England called Bristol. In Bristol, there were protests 1980, 1981. And this friend, Steve Reicher, a psychologist, interviewed people involved in those protests. And one of the strange things was that they knew very well who they were attacking. So if you look at the windows that were broken, the windows were broken of the large outside department stores, of the government offices, but no windows were broken of private cars or of private houses. That people kind of like aware of what they were doing. So I think in these kind of political mobilizations that you're referring to, the events in India, for example, I think we need to look at the political underpinning of these protests and the way they're being used by people and deliberately engineered, rather than people losing their minds and not knowing what they're doing. So there's a kind of deeper process. You know, in a way, this is bad news, because if it was just hysteria, you could maybe treat the hysteria, but it's more difficult. It's a more difficult political problem we have to deal with when people actively and willingly get involved in these kind of things.
Right. So since we can never be outside structure, outside language, or tyranny of political religious ideology, there will never be an end of liberation movements. And since the clinic in your book is also the space for unlocking subjective freedom and power, so my question is, what is the end of psychoanalysis for a patient?
Okay, so it's more bad news, which is that there's no end of psychoanalysis. I think it's very difficult to say that psychoanalysis has come to an end, because people always end up, they come out of the analysis and there are always things that they haven't spoken about. There are things that they haven't had time to think about. And a lot of the work in psychoanalysis is after the analysis happens, where people reflect on the things that they've talked about and how they've made sense of them. And so it's difficult to say that there's an end of analysis. Analysis carries on when the clinical work has finished, that the analytic work carries on as people think about it and as they talk to others. And a lot of people go back into psychoanalysis again to pick up on things that have occurred to them, that they want to talk about, or new problems that they're facing. So there's kind of question about the end of analysis there. It's a kind of another question, which is about the end of psychoanalysis as such. I said that psychoanalysis came into being as a response to capitalism. It came into being at the same time as capitalism. And although there's no way of testing this out quickly, my bet is that just as there was no psychoanalysis before the 18th century, you know, Spartacus standing up against slavery, you know, didn't need psychoanalysis. It wouldn't have made much sense to him. Neither did he need Marxism, and that wouldn't make much sense to him either, because there wasn't a proletariat. So in the future, when we hope to live in a fairer, more equal world, after capitalism is over, maybe we won't need psychoanalysis at all. Maybe it won't exist. It'll all be over. The forms of alienation that we suffer will be different. The forms of exploitation that we suffer will be over. And maybe we'll deal with any existing problems that we have in a different kind of way. I have a colleague, a Brazilian colleague, Gabriel Tupinamba, who said, well, maybe in the future, you know, people will go to the park and they'll sit on a bench and they'll speak to someone next to them and they'll talk about their problems, and maybe they'll come back the next day and maybe it'll be the same person or a different person. And that's the way that something like psychoanalysis will happen, but it won't be in an enclosed clinical space with all of the kind of apparatus of diagnosis and interpretation. It'll be something completely different. I would go further and I would say, well, maybe we won't have parks. Maybe we won't have park benches. You know, we have to be open to the possibility that human beings and human experience will be as different in the future as it was in the past. And I don't think we should hold on to psychoanalysis as a cure-all for all time. It wasn't always with us and it won't always be.
Right, very interesting. So I do agree with your contention that the healthy body or the normal mind acts as paradigms against which the abnormal and disabled bodies are measured. However, what do you have to say about the role of psychiatric medications in the treatment of illnesses ranging from depression to schizophrenia?
Oh gosh, this is a very, very difficult one. And it's, I suppose, we're very clear in the book, Psychoanalysis and Revolution, that psychoanalysis is not a medical treatment. It's an alternative to a medical treatment. But when I was saying earlier that people might make different choices about the forms of support that they have, I have to say that that must, at the moment, include access to psychiatry. Now, I say this very reluctantly because a lot of psychiatric treatments are so harmful. I'm absolutely against electroconvulsive therapy, for example, because there's no evidence that it works at all, and there's lots of evidence that it's harmful. But some of the medications people find useful. The question is what control they have over their choices to make use of the medications, and what support they have to come off the medications when they decide that the medications have done enough, when they've performed their purposes. The problem with medical psychiatry is that it often treats the medication as like other kinds of medicine, as if it's a kind of curing something, as if it's rebalancing the serotonin or other kinds of chemical imbalance inside the brain. But that myth of rebalancing has been debunked many, many times, including by psychiatrists. And so we need to think about these medications as being useful tools in the same way as we might drink alcohol or smoke a cigarette or play a video game, you know, that we make use of this as we want, and we're able to get out of it again as we want, rather than being trapped in the psychiatric system. So I would say that psychiatric medication has a role, but it must accept that it has a subordinate role as only one of the options that people might make use of.
Right. And this is my last question. So, and finally, what it has to do with the major difference between psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, especially. So you call psychotherapy, fake and an ally to the capitalist forces, since it attempts to solve and neutralize and not solve. So is the accusation simply due to the absence of the political in the therapist's room?
Yeah. Okay. So you saved the most difficult question till last, haven't you? When we do psychoanalysis, it helps people to make sense of who they are and to make sense of how they have become who they are. And when people engage in psychoanalysis, it may be something that is resolving issues for them. It may feel as if it's helpful, but it also may be painful. It may be something that is difficult for people to come to terms with, to remember things that have happened in their past, or to understand what the significance of those things, of those events were. So psychoanalysis doesn't pretend to make people happier, but it does have therapeutic effects. That is, in the process of talking and in the process of understanding, we can become better able to live our lives, to navigate relationships, to understand better what we're doing in our working life. And so the psychoanalysis has a kind of therapeutic element. Now, my problem with psychotherapy as such is that I think that psychotherapy offers too much and it doesn't go far enough. That psychotherapy pretends to solve the problems, which it can't do, so it's offering too much. Psychotherapy tries to resolve the conflict between unconscious and conscious experience. It tries to resolve unconscious conflicts. It kind of promises people that they will be happier and everything will be resolved. That in some forms of psychotherapy, it promises that they'll be able to think more clearly without catastrophizing or whatever, if they're using CBT, or it promises that they'll be fully functioning human beings, all of this kind of thing. I think they're promising too much and they can't deliver. They can't deliver because of the nature of human beings as human beings that are human. We're beings of conflict and contradiction. That's in our nature. And we have to learn to live with that. But having said that, having said all of that, kind of negative things about psychotherapy, and this always kind of makes enemies among psychotherapists. But what is very important here, and we say this very clearly in the book, is that there's a kind of status hierarchy in the Psy professions, where there are psychoanalysts at the top of the pyramid, then there are the psychoanalytic psychotherapists halfway down, and then there are all the psychodynamic counselors at the bottom. And many psychotherapists and counselors make use of psychoanalytic ideas. Even if they're not psychoanalytic, they make use of psychoanalytic ideas like transference, like repetition, the notion of the unconscious, and so on. They make use of psychoanalytic ideas. And I would say that just as there are many psychoanalysts, people who call themselves psychoanalysts, who aren't doing psychoanalysis because they're behaving like little masters, because they're bound up in the psychiatric system, because they make diagnoses here, there, and everywhere, and they operate like medics or psychologists instead of psychoanalysts. There are many psychoanalysts who are not doing psychoanalysis. And the other side of the coin is that there are many therapists and counselors who are doing genuine psychoanalysis. And we need to link with them and break across the status hierarchy in the psych professions in order for us to work all together and to break down the barriers that divide professionals from each other. There's nothing so great about being a psychoanalyst who's got a title of psychoanalyst. Okay, I went through a training. It was quite a few years. Some psychoanalysts are very jealous when they hold on to their label, and they're very annoyed that other people are getting a look in on their debates. No, I think it's great that we can have a debate across psychotherapy and counseling and break down those professional barriers that divide us. And also, in the process, think about breaking down the barriers between the professionals and all of the people who make use of psychoanalysis. That's part of the radical political project that we're part of. Psychoanalysis has something to offer, but psychoanalysts need to learn from people as well and reflect on what they're doing and transform what they're doing so it is something turned into something that is genuinely liberatory.
Okay, great. I have no more questions, but the session is open for questions for whoever wants to ask. We already have two questions. One from Shondipta Banerjee. Shondipta, would you mind coming, switching on your audio and maybe asking directly?
Thank you, sir. So my question is, what happens in the political extremism? Like, what is the psychology behind?
So what is the psychology behind political extremism, you mean?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for your question.
Well, I think it depends what you mean by extremism. You know, I'm an extremist. I'm a revolutionary Marxist. I am absolutely committed to the overthrow of the capitalist political economic system and through ending patriarchy and colonialism. I'm an extremist. And I will take extreme steps when I can to bring that about. Right. Does that mean that you can understand what I'm doing using psychology? Well, maybe, but I would say, well, no, I've made political choices. Now, if you're talking about political extremists on the right, I would give the same answer. People make political choices. They make the wrong political choices. And they often make political choices that go against their own interests. And we need to be able to talk with these people, as well as being able to mobilize ourselves to stop them when they're actually doing something harmful politically and practically. So I kind of like, I'm pushing back against one of the assumptions in your question, Sandipta. I don't think we should use psychology to understand political extremism. But I think, I'm guessing that in your question, you have another view of this.
Right. So we have one more question from Sabyasachi Mishra. So he's asking, can hystericization be linked with the idea that, you know, how one person gets hysteric by looking at the other? Maybe it's like a chain reaction. Is there a link between that?
Well, it's certainly one of the ways that hysteria works. And I think you can find these kind of collective phenomena at work in schools sometimes. You can see it in families. You can see it in family relationships where one person has a kind of symptom and it becomes taken up and replicated by the others. There's a kind of hysterical process there. But I think that, again, I would say that that's something that could go alongside the political events that you're trying to understand, but it's not something that explains those political events. You need to understand the conditions in which people are living and the sense that they make of their condition before using the notion of hysteria. So it's a kind of hysteria is a concept that we can use to make sense of experience, but it's not a very useful concept to explain what is happening in the political realm.
Right. Shatabdi, will you switch on your audio and maybe shorten your question and ask? It's a pretty long question. Do you want to switch on your audio and ask?
Sir, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yes.
Yep. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Hi.
Yeah, good evening, sir. I really enjoyed your session, and so thank you so very much. And my question is, from a Lacanian point of view, do you think that protesters and demonstrators, they see their ideal ego among themselves because the self is very much fragmentary, one which is made of rebellion that wants to subvert and challenge. And by seeing that ideal ego among themselves, do you think that this need to achieve an ideal, to have a better world, is this chasing after ego ideal that could only lead to an endless sea of signification with no end to human suffering? And that because in many in the past, even there have been many political rebellions and demonstrations, but racism or sexism for that matter has never really ended. Are we just kind of looking into a future where ideal as something can never be achieved, and we're just kind of, having maybe a pipe dream about it?
I think it's possible for some of those involved in these demonstrations that they do have that ideal at work. I think you might be right that for some people that ideal might be important. But I think you would need to ask them one by one and to have them in the clinic before you could make that kind of diagnosis. No? I don't think it's something that is useful or helpful to make as a general blanket diagnosis of everyone involved in any political movement. So when I'm involved in a demonstration, for example, myself, there are moments where I'm just thinking about what the political aims of the demonstration are. There are moments when I'm meeting friends and comrades that I haven't seen for a while, and we're chatting, and there's kind of personal relationships being built up again, and I enjoy that. And there are moments when I get caught up in the spirit of the thing, and I'm thinking, yeah, maybe it really will be possible to end this particular law or to overthrow this government. And at that moment, maybe something of an ideal comes into operation for me. But this is quite specific to me. I'm confessing this to you because precisely because it's something that depends on each individual as they come into politics and they relate to politics. So I think I'm very wary about applying psychoanalysis to politics. And there's lots of attempts to apply psychoanalytic ideas to politics that I think then in the process, they reduce the politics to the psychoanalysis. The political analysis disappears and you have a psychoanalytic analysis instead. So I would say that psychoanalysis has a place, very useful place inside the clinic, and it has some ideas that we can make use of to understand the organizations that we're part of, the political organizations that we're part of. But I don't think applying it to all of these political phenomena is the road that I want to go down. So I would say, yes, you might be right, but I don't know.
Right. So we have one question for Ankita. Would you want to switch on your? Yes.
Hi, Ankita. I'm actually going to see someone rather than just have a disembodied voice.
Good afternoon, Professor Parker.
Hi.
It's great connecting with you, and I just had a great discussion with you as well. So I hope you hear me, sir.
I can hear you fine, yes.
So in the beginning of the session, you mentioned that society causes a lot of stress and problems in our life. And what I believe, we can't discard the fact that a society is, like, we are the part of a society, right? The society we are living in. So how can we normalize psychoanalysis in our daily life? Because I have seen people then not very comfortable talking about the stress, the things causing a lot of trouble in the life. So how it can be normalized?
Well, we can use psychoanalytic ideas in our everyday life, but I think we have to be very careful how we use them. One example would be in the way that we repeat relationships. Part of the thing that brings people to a clinic is that they are repeating relationships that are self-sabotaging or harmful to them, that they've had bad relationships in the past, maybe from their family, maybe from partners, lovers. And there's something in those relationships that repeats. So they end up finding the same kind of friends who might be dependent on them, or friends that, who control them, that they end up finding the same kind of friends or the same kind of relations or the same kind of lovers. And that repetition of relationships is something that a psychoanalytic sensitivity or a psychoanalytic understanding could help us with. Yeah. Another would be repression, when we push things away. Freud says, and I agree with Freud here, Freud says that when we repress something, we're pushing it away, and it takes a lot of energy. We have to keep pushing it away. We have to keep refusing to think about it. So it's the process of repression as we keep covering it over, thinking about other things instead of thinking about the thing we don't want to think about. That process is the most important part of repression. So that energy that we spend in repressing is an important part, most important part. So if we're thinking about our everyday lives, we could bear that in mind and think, well, the task isn't simply to remember these things and dig them out, to dig out these memories so everything will be okay. No, the task is to reflect on how we keep pushing it, how we keep pushing away, how we keep repressing, what energy we're putting into it. So we can think about using these psychoanalytic processes to make sense of how we engage in everyday life. I can think of another example, if we've got time, which is free association. In the clinic, free association doesn't mean that you say everything that comes into your head. Free association is an attempt to say everything, and you notice what you aren't able to say, So you're able to notice the blockages, you're able to notice the repression. So free association, strictly speaking, is impossible, but it's worth trying so you can notice what holds you back. And in a similar kind of way, when we engage in boycotts of different places, say, I'll give the example of the boycott, divestment and sanctions protests against the state of Israel. It isn't because we don't want to speak to Israelis. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're changing the way the conversation will happen, so that our conversation will always be with individuals instead of through institutions. So the boycott is against the institutions rather than the individuals. And so it's a different kind of thinking about free association. It's a way of thinking about the conditions in which we speak. So we always reflect on the conditions in which we speak. That's what we do in psychoanalysis, rather than imagining that we should simply blurt everything out and everything will be okay.
Thank you so much.
Right. We have one question from Onisha. Onisha, would you like to come online?
Yes,
switch on your
sure.
audio? Yes.
Hello. Thank you for such a thought-provoking
Hi.
session. Just had a question which is not really academic, but like it just came to my mind. Basically, when you talked about like you made a distinction between psychology and psychoanalysis, and you talked about how psychoanalysis personalizes us, but psychology looks at us as objects. So, but I feel like there are certain problems that arise with personalization as well. Like when we make like sometimes we're unable to see beyond our own trauma to how it makes us a part of society, and like it makes us misuse the term like the personal is political, and things like basically the rise of identity politics that has taken place in like recent years. So I just want to ask, how can we prevent that, like at the say simultaneously while personalizing ourselves, how can we like look beyond our own trauma to how it like makes us part of society, and how can like we can enact social change as a part of society. Sorry.
I'm not sure whether I've got your question right, but I'll try to answer it, and then you tell me if I've been able to get what you're saying. When we engage in political activity, we always do it through making some kind of connection with other people who are the same as us, okay? And that might be through other kinds of worker in the same industry in different parts of the world, maybe through international solidarity. Or it might be through links with people who are like us, in different political movements, through lesbian and gay movements, or movements of ethnic minorities, or people with disabilities. And that is sometimes very useful as a kind of step forward to thinking about what we have in common with other people. But I think the task is to think about what we have in common with other people while respecting what the links are with other people who are different from us. So I think part of the task of politics is being able to deal with this similarity and difference, and building movements that respect the self-organization of the oppressed on their own terms. So people always come together around issues that affect them directly. So the question is how they mobilize their identities in a way that is empowering, but also mobilize their identities in a way that enables them to connect with other kinds of identity. So Black workers and women workers and lesbian and gay workers in a factory or in a corporation will have a lot of things that bring them together. And those kind of struggles will form a different identity, an identity of being a worker through which they're able to challenge exploitation. But at the same time, the movement has to take seriously the divisions of sexism and racism and so on that lead people to fight for their own particular rights within that movement. I think we have to think about our diversity in political movements as a strength rather than a weakness. It's not a weakness when people are empowered to speak for themselves. Does that connect with what you were saying, Anwisha?
Yes, I think so. I think so. It does. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we have one last question, and two people are asking the same question.
Okay, good.
Yeah, which is, do psychoanalysts suffer from some kind of God complex?
Oh, some of them do. Yes, I've met plenty of them. Yeah, no, it's a very good question, actually, because some psychoanalysts turn to psychoanalysis as a kind of faith or a kind of worldview. And when you have a worldview in a system that is hierarchically organized, then there's a temptation that you want to become the priest, or if possible, to become the god. And so there's a real danger, I think, in psychoanalysis becoming a worldview that will explain anything and everything. And Freud was very clear in his own writings. He said that psychoanalysis is not a worldview in and of itself. The closest that psychoanalysis comes to being a worldview, Freud said, the closest that psychoanalysis comes to being a worldview is the worldview of science. But I would say that even there's a danger in treating science as a worldview. You know, science is very useful for lots of things, but it's not very useful for understanding our nature as human beings and our own subjectivity. So there are limits even to science. So I'm not keen on treating psychoanalysis as a worldview. I think it can be quite dangerous, and that's where you have the gods appearing inside it. And neither would I say that Marxism, which is something I'm very dear to, neither is Marxism a worldview. It doesn't explain anything and everything either. And that's a lesson that we should have learned from the Soviet Union, where Marxism was turned into the faith of the bureaucracy. And there were lots of little gods and tin pot leaders there that turned Marxism into a kind of worldview or into a kind of faith. So psychoanalysis is intensely self-critical. It should dissolve these claims to faith and worldview. And eventually, if we have time, as the years go on, after we've got rid of capitalism, then maybe psychoanalysis will be able to reflect on itself and dissolve itself, and we'll have something better in its place.
Right. So here we come to the end of the session. And thank you so much, Professor Parker, for your reflections on our collective future, the practice of psychoanalysis, and the seeds of revolution it inherits. I hope we have such sessions with you again in the near future. And thank you so much. And thanks to all the participants for being so patient and cooperative. Thank you so much, Professor Parker.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.